Sunday, July 5th, 2026. I'm Anthony Davis. Welcome to the Weekend Show, where we make the time to consider the news of the week. You can support my work and independent journalism on Substack at The Anthony Davis. As America marks the 250th anniversary of its founding and the 55th anniversary of the 26th Amendment, today's guests argue that the country has reached another constitutional crossroads. They believe it's time for a second founding led by young voters with an ambitious agenda to expand voting rights, strengthen democracy, and modernize America's political institutions for the next 250 years. Professor Yael Bromberg is a voting rights attorney, democracy scholar, and advocate whose work focuses on constitutional reform, youth voting rights, and expanding democratic participation in the United States. Professor Rev. Cornell William Brooks is a civil rights attorney, former president and CEO of the NAACP, and professor at Harvard Kennedy School, where he teaches leadership, democracy, and social justice. Welcome both to the Weekend Show.
It's good to be with you.
Thanks for having us.
Cornell, let me start with you, and let's just talk about this op-ed that was released today, because this has been quite a significant amount of work, and I know that from the conversations that you and I have had before on this show, so much of the work that you've been doing over the years has kind of led to this moment.
Yeah, precisely. So, first of all, let me just note the moment in which we find ourselves. So here we are on this anniversary, this is the day after this tremendous anniversary of America's founding, a founding in which young people played a wildly disproportionate part, and in terms of sacrifice, in terms of soldiers, protesters during the Revolutionary War period. And so fast forward 250 years later, we have young people who are among the most anxious, most worried, most concerned about the future of democracy. And so because I've spent many years fighting for voting rights, one of the things that has struck me over and over again is while we have often fixated our attention on racial voter suppression, this racial voter suppression takes place alongside what I call generational voter suppression, which is to say suppression against young people. I'll give you one concrete example. So when the Shelby versus Holder Supreme Court decision came down, which gutted the Voting Rights Act, which made American democracy as we understand it possible, almost immediately a state like Texas implemented voter restrictions, and one of which I think your viewers, your listeners will really be appalled by, which is to say they outlawed the use of student IDs to vote, as opposed to the IDs you use to carry a concealed weapon. So in other words, an ID which allows you to carry a book of Shakespeare, a book of engineering, a book of English across a college campus, deemed to be civically insufficient to vote, as opposed to an ID which allows you to carry a concealed weapon. And those who carry concealed weapons in the state of Texas at that time could be 21 years of age or older, right? As opposed to the 26th Amendment, which says that 18-year-olds and older can vote. And so what we see here is that those who are on the front lines of democracy are in the crosshairs, right, of voter suppression. And so the reason I'm so excited about writing this op-ed, or really lending my support in terms of this op-ed with Professor Bromberg, is that she nails it, right? That young people should not be the casualties of voter suppression, along with anybody else, but we should in fact have an agenda to support them in leading the country into the next 250 years.
The place that we find ourselves right now is bittersweet, isn't it? Because it's supposed to be a celebration, and really, certainly at least half the country, possibly more, are unable to celebrate in the way that it was intended. Aside from the fact that this current Trump regime has completely ballsed up the events and celebrations and profiteered from these things that really should be a celebration of the people, and somehow managed to make it all about himself. Professor Bromberg, let's talk about this specifically with regard to the op-ed, but also how you feel being in DC and what these last few months, or 18 months, if you want to go that far, or even decade, as it's taken up much of our lives, how it feels right now.
Well, being in Washington, D.C. is very surreal, right? The children on the playgrounds in elementary school are talking about how their peers' parents lost their jobs because they were federal employees, right? And have had to move. So even among the children, they are talking about, for lack of a better word, King Trump, and the effects that his decision making is having on their everyday lives. And for 4th of July itself, for the celebration, right? This is something that all of us should be able to hold dear. And yet there is such a extreme level of corruption, self-profiteering, and robbing from our children's futures and financial and social health, that it's the best word that I have is just surreal, because this is not the America that we want. This is not the America that we liberated ourselves from Great Britain from. And, you know, the amount, for example, of the fireworks display that's taking place, the amount of attention on this kind of grandstanding, that instead of leading with substance, we have to lead with show, or an effort of show and might, is completely anathema to the principles and the purpose of this nation's founding.
He wanted the largest firework display in history, but to him, it's always about the biggest and the tallest. And I mean, it takes me right back to 9/11, when he kind of called into that TV station and said, "Now I have the biggest building in New York City, in Manhattan." I mean, this is the character of the man that we're talking about. Do you think that of the people that still do support him, and we should not forget that 77 million people did vote for Donald Trump, how many of them voted for this? We know they voted for the man, but how many people do you think voted for this, Professor Brooks?
So I think while the president has enjoyed a tremendous amount of support, on the last election day, it's important to note that he has the highest disapproval ratings of any modern president. So this demonstrates that what the people supported, he no longer supports, right? Number one. Number two, they certainly did not support the hijacking of democracy in service of autocracy. They didn't support that. They certainly didn't support ICE agents and the Border Patrol rounding up American citizens, American residents in American neighborhoods with the use of handcuffs and handguns and long guns and assault weapons. They didn't support that. And all the polls demonstrate that. They certainly didn't support the level of graft and corruption today, which animated, let us note this, animated our founding fathers and founding mothers and forebears in terms of their opposition to the leadership of King George, right? And taxes being imposed on American citizens and residents at that time, or having British soldiers literally taking over people's homes. This is not unlike what we see in the present moment. So the point being here is the fact that the president has enjoyed popularity on election day sufficient to win an election by no means gives him a pass with respect to trampling over our rights in the present and literally desecrating the most significant July 4th celebration that we've had in 2 centuries. There's no excuse for that.
Yeah, I mean, it's no wonder, piggybacking on what Professor Brooks provides, is that there was a recent Pew poll that found that only 34% of Americans support President Trump. A second poll found 35% and similar 61% disapproval rates. I think that this is pretty unprecedented for where we are as a nation, and it beckons us to reflect on the purpose of our founding, the purpose of our various reconstructions, and where we are in the moment today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. These conversations are being had in universities all over the country, arguably across the world, where people are debating the situation that America finds itself in and its effect on the rest of the world. And of course, America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. We know that. We're seeing an energy crisis courtesy of his attack on Iran and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Nobody really knows if it's open or not right now. I mean, that's the level of confusion that comes out and chaos that comes out of this administration. But just going back to those 77 million people for a moment, I get a sense that it's very difficult to convince those people to cross the aisle and vote for Democrats. So maybe we could talk about how we brand these midterms and the next general election in a way that it is a choice between democracy versus fascism, because it really is, that serious, and that it's not really about political parties anymore. To me, this transcends the politics of a two-party republic. Could you talk to that?
Well, let us know this. The celebration yesterday, in terms of the nation's founding, was celebrated as an anniversary of a young democracy, an aspirational democracy. You didn't hear people cheering for the triumph of the Whigs, the Federalists, the Democrats, or the Republicans, not political parties, but rather a set of ideas enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, which gave rise to the holiday. So in other words, people were talking about equality. They were talking about democracy. They were talking about what it means to be a democracy in the context of the Declaration of Independence going forward. And when I say talking, I don't mean the chattering class. I don't merely mean professors at American University like Yael or professors at Harvard, but I'm talking about like regular people, regular children in elementary schools who were producing school reports where they literally were writing about, well, what does America mean? What does the Declaration of Independence stand for? And the words least used were the words like Democrat and Republic, as opposed to democracy, equality, justice, what it means to be, in terms of the Declaration of Independence, being endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, which, the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims understand that to mean having been created in the image of God, we are accorded dignity and rights. Like, these are the kinds of ideas, and this is the vocabulary of the people, as opposed to those who are simply thinking about winning the next election. So if we are to win the next election in terms of democracy, we got to use the vocabulary of regular, ordinary people who understand more profoundly than many of us on college campuses that the issues really go beyond just who wins, who lost, and whose poll numbers look better, because that's not what people are voting for and what they're concerned about. $4 a gallon gas, right, is not, you can brand it D or R, but it's still expensive coming out of the pump.
Yael, is it ironic that we are celebrating the escape from the British rule and King George and all of that stuff, and here we are 250 years later, and we're trying to escape a king yet again, and that arguably this anniversary might do something to make people recognize the fact that America kind of finds itself in a similar position.
I think it is ironic, and it's a touchstone for us to reimagine what the next 250 years might look like. Our electoral process didn't always look like the way it looks today, right? after the nation's first Reconstruction, many states had an advent called fusion voting, where voters can vote across party lines based on for the sect, essentially, that they were associated with. That type of fusion voting allowed for fundamental changes, including the eradication of slavery, right? It allowed different forms of parties to fuse their politics across party lines. Fusion voting remains in effect in New York City and in Connecticut, but our political process looks very different now. And with very, very little attention, for example, to the primary electoral system, when so many decisions need to be made that are so consequential for the types of candidates that are presented to us in the general election. And yet those primaries get pretty much no attention. And speaking of youth voters, they are just completely relegated during the primary election season. Those primary elections take place in June, right? What else happens in June? The students move from their campus addresses, right? And there's no systemic way to address their proactive availability to participate in the electoral process in the location in which they are fixed to, right? So these are, I think that this 250-year anniversary calls on us to reflect where we've come from, the American Revolution, from king, authoritarian, taxation and no representation rule. Again, being in Washington, D.C., that is directly reflective in the fact that we don't have statehood here, and pushes us to reconceive the reality that we may push through. And that's not limited to an election for the Democratic Party. That is way beyond the concept of partisanship, or even cross-partisanship. It's about basic American vanilla apple pie democracy.
Young people have only known Donald Trump. You know, I mentioned this decade. It's this kind of decade of this hellscape that people who have been voting for decades themselves have had to adjust to. For young people who are maybe voting for the very first time in 2028, they don't know any different to this. This kind of clown show has been normalized, maybe just by default. How do we navigate that? How do we educate those young people to know that this is not normal?
Anthony, may I tie the question you're asking now to the question that you asked before about George, right?
Yes, go ahead.
So one of Martin Luther King's most noted sermons and essay, was called The American Dream. And in this sermon, in this essay, he tells the story of Rip Van Winkle. As you recall, Rip Van Winkle, the story by Washington Irving, he leaves his village, goes up into the mountains as a young man and falls asleep. Wakes up 20 years later as an old man, descends the mountain and discovers that the picture that he expected on the wall of a local tavern, he expected the picture of King George III. And he discovers not King George's image or Instagram or portrait, but rather George Washington. And King told that story because he wanted to emphasize that we need not sleep through a revolution like Rip Van Winkle. We need not sleep through a founding, right? And so when you ask about young people who have essentially grown up in the age of Trump, well, first of all, the King George then and the King Trump now are not going to be forever on the throne. Point number one. Point number two, this is not a moment for us to engage in a kind of national narcoleptic nap, right? This is not the time for us to be asleep. And so what that means is, in terms of engaging young people who are anxious to be engaged, let us note that, right? We have to build the architecture, the infrastructure of democracy, which means putting polling places on college campuses. It means eliminating the barriers to the vote. It means mass mobilization of young people. It means an aggressive, morally ambitious agenda that inspires young people and older people. In other words, young people and those who are Rip Van Winkles, who've slept through a couple of elections. So my point being is this is a critical moment. And I think Dr. King literally reminds us that, we've dealt with kings before, right? This may be the worst king, at least in terms of presidential historians that we've had in some time, perhaps, or I should say undoubtedly ever, the worst king, worst president. But it does present us a tragic opportunity to engage young people. But that really requires a discrete, concrete set of legislative reforms, constitutional reforms, and an agenda and a program that makes a difference. So I just couldn't resist the temptation to talk about King Trump and King George.
Yeah. I mean, Democrats did have the opportunity under Joe Biden to bring about some change, and they kind of trusted that the institutions would hold. And Joe Biden, in hindsight, was an essential placeholder, but he wasn't a revolutionist in any way. Do you worry that unless the Democrats find a candidate for 2028 who really is a reformer and who has the confidence to shake things up and to, pack the court, as your op-ed describes, I mean, there needs to be some pretty radical changes so that the U.S. doesn't fall back into a system whereby it can allow the uprising of a dictator.
It's an interesting question. I think that what is radical today is actually quite moderate, right? The notion
radical for America. It's not actually radical anywhere else.
Right. That's exactly right. Access to healthcare is a radical concept in America. Equal access for affordable healthcare. But in other places, that's just quite normal. And this is because we find ourselves in a barren state. I mean, the fact that there are this mega concentration of wealth, unprecedented income inequality in the United States, while the top 1% is running away with tax cuts and tax privileges, while everyone else has to kind of pay it forward and go into debt. In fact, is extraordinary. And the moment for us is one in which we need to have young people participate in the process. But I want to go back to this concept of kind of what's radical. We have lost sight of what the normal middle is, right? And because our politics have become so polarized, and as we know, the people on the edges are always the most loud, they end up silencing the majority, right? And so I think I want to get us back to normal. And back to normal means that we have to actually embrace reforms that allow for that. There were previous efforts to expand the United States Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court has gone through various phases of reform. Having something like a binding ethics code for the Supreme Court justices is not radical. That's normal for the rest of the federal and state benches. Right. So I want to get us back to normal. And then we could talk about radical later. I think we have to reimagine what is quite normal. It is normal for people to participate in the political process. It is normal in many other countries to have a measure called universal voting, which is kind of a psychological tool more than a criminalized one, which effectively, nobody likes the word, but it's mandatory voting. The expectation is that you vote, and that if you don't vote, you'll get a little ding on your tax penalty, right? Like there's a small amount that you have to.
That's right. Australia does this. It's like you pay like a $20 fine.
Yeah, right. It's nominal. It's not really a penalty, but it's more of a psychological tool. And we have this measure in election modernization as well in the United States called automatic voter registration, where instead of opting in when you go to the DMV to register to vote, the presumption is that you want to register to vote and there's an opportunity for you to opt out. So we just need to, I don't think these are radical measures. I think they're normal measures. Same day voter registration is in place in 24 states. That is normal. The 25th state just passed a measure. I believe it was, Idaho just passed a measure to send a message to Congress to ratify a 28th Amendment to reform the way in which we interpret Citizens United and to get money out of the political system. This is normal. 70%, supermajority of Americans want to reform campaign finance reform. I want to get us back to normal.
Yeah, let me footnote and put an exclamation point on what Yael has lifted up. I teach my students that when the other side is attempting to radicalize the conventional, that's a moment for you to conventionalize what is deemed to be radical. Here's what I mean. Many of the things that Professor Bromberg has lifted up are things that we have done, attempted to do, or already doing. But we have this rhetoric of those things which are deemed to be radical are beyond reach. So in other words, when we think about the Electoral College, the notion that you have a country of 340 plus million people that don't popularly elect the president, right? That you can have a president elected with the majority of the Electoral College vote, but not the popular vote. The fact that we have attempted as a country to amend the Constitution to address this problem. The fact that the Electoral College is really a kind of relic of the slavocracy of the past, right? And so the point being here is give people credit for what they've already attempted to do and use the precedent of their democracy activism and their commitment to their country to open up the window of possibilities in terms of what could be done. And instead of damning the entire endeavor as radical and impossible. Well, that is just quite simply it is ahistorical and I would argue immoral, right? Because you're taking off the table the things that the people have tried to do, right? And so the reason why, when we think about the history of this country and the right to vote. So in terms of America's founding, we tend to think of it like a pebble thrown into the pond of history and ripples of inclusion, moving ever outward. Well, the fact of the matter is we've had women who had to fight for the 19th Amendment, Black women and Black men, as well as white abolitionists who had to fight for the 15th Amendment. And so the point, and veterans in World War II and the Vietnam War who had to fight literally for the right for young people to vote. So the point being here is we've had battles, skirmishes, efforts to bring about change. And so this whole notion of those unduly cranky conservatives, and I don't mean that ideologically, I mean that in terms of moral imagination, who want to condemn what everybody else is trying to do and say that what they might do is impossible. It's just ridiculous.
But it's always like the worst kept secret in Washington is that conservatives, or MAGA Republicans, as we should probably call them now, complain about spending and rising debt, and yet every conservative government has added more debt and not been able to reduce the deficit in the same way that democratic governments have. But maybe we should look to New York and to the phenomenon that is Zoran Mamdani, because he has put his money where his mouth is. And he got elected on policies that Republicans might refer to as radical. Me growing up in a social democracy recognizes as normal. And he didn't just use them as campaign promises, but he's actually seen them through. And he made a speech on Friday morning to, celebrate the 250th anniversary of the United States, and talked about immigration and talked about all of the things that Donald Trump is trying to erase from America's history. So is this proof? Is he a kind of test case for the kind of, he can't be president because he wasn't born in the US, but is he a test case for the kind of president that will actually do what they say they're going to do and maybe surprise people by the fact that it can be done?
Let us note this. Donald Trump has been referred to as a radical relative to traditional Republicans, right? So in other words, the idea, the notion of breaking certain ideological confines and having a bold agenda is powerful in and of itself. A rather patrician Democrat by the name of Franklin Roosevelt was deemed to be a radical, and his wife was deemed to be even more of a radical. So my point being here is anyone who has a bold agenda in this moment, who's thoughtful, who has authenticity. I think Mamdani gives a lot of credit for that in terms of authenticity, and who connects with young people, I think has an electoral advantage. Anybody on any side of the aisle in any party, I think, will have an advantage. And so I think Mamdani, along with other candidates around the country, are emblematic of the fact that people want change. Now, does that mean that the country has suddenly become a country of democratic socialists? I don't think so. What it does speak to is a deeper need for authenticity. I think a bold, relevant agenda that is generationally sensitive in terms of young people, and this speaks to real needs. Like, in other words, you can't have a party in the White House dismissing affordability as essentially a phantom worry of the working class. That is quite simply, that's just not, nobody's going to win on that, on either side of the aisle. So I think Mamdani is an important political figure, but I think this is bigger than that. And it's bigger than New York City, and it's bigger than just the Democrats. Now, I'm a Democrat. Like, let me put my cards on the table. But I think it would be unwise to think if everyone imitates any particular political figure's rhetoric or agenda without the authenticity, without the kind of fit between the politics and the policy, that they're going to win. I just think it doesn't work.
I would add that I think that the moment calls for something larger, that this is an example of what has succeeded electorally in New York City, based on certain indications of who comes out to vote for those elections as well, and the presentation of that particular race and who the opposition candidate was. So I wouldn't take that as an example of where the country is going. And I think that we're very broken. We are divided in ways that are real, and also in ways that are completely psychological. Like, to me, the fact that 70% of Americans want to overturn Citizens United and get rid of money in politics, we're talking about middle America farmers. And as I often talk with Professor Brooks about, the movement against the data centers is extraordinary. Yes. Because you have like mom farmers fighting in all parts of the country, right? From South Carolina to South New Jersey to middle America farmland, exercising their civic and democratic muscle to fight against special interests. So we know what this muscle feels like. And I think this is a matter of exercising it and flexing it and putting us in a position, in a training, so that we can continue to move forward. And I would just say that if we are looking for salvation in the Democratic Party, that we will be massively disappointed. That will not happen, right? Our political system right now, our duopoly, the political duopoly that we have, is not structured for full and complete representation or happiness in the political process. We need different ways of reform. Ranked choice voting is one example of that, which would allow for more voters to have their voices be reflected in the candidate that ultimately gets elected. What we're seeing is that where a candidate earns the majority of voters, and there's multiple candidates in the field, does not necessarily mean that the standard bearers are therefore fully representative of the voting electorate, right? So we need new ways to think about and conceive of electoral reform. These are very common sense mechanisms as well that are available to us. And ultimately, I would say we need to come together as a country. And there are indications of divisiveness in the New York race in particular, that I think that we can overcome, that most Americans want a politics that is normal, that is not show, right? I'm not talking about New York specifically. I'm talking about in general, right? They want boring politics. They want to be able to participate. They don't want to constantly have to fight against voter suppression. They don't want to constantly fight against rollbacks on the distribution of veterans benefits, right? They don't want women to be bleeding out in hospitals because they can't access very, very normal medical care. Americans want dignity. And I think that that goes back to what the good Reverend, we call him Professor, but he is Professor Reverend Brooks was offering, which is this notion about what human dignity, liberty, equality requires in the moment and what is always required, right? We've needed the sense of autonomy, division of church and state, which we're seeing new revolutions of in Texas, for example, with the mandating of showing the 10 Commandments in the schools. We've always pushed back against this. And the fact that we are 250 years young, I was describing to my son, who is my 6-year-old son, who is asking me if 100 years is old for a person to live to. And I said, yes, 100 years is old. But if you think about the country, you put 250-year people together, and that is the arc of the country. That is extraordinary young.
And that, I guess, is very much the diagnosis for America, certainly the way the rest of the world sees it, is that this is a country's adolescence. And compared to other nations who've been through multiple uprisings and civil wars and various things, that you know, the country I'm from has a constitution that is unwritten. And yet people struggle to get their head around how that works. But if the country is old enough, then it has formed its law in the kind of psyche of the nation. As we are celebrating, I don't know whether to use the word celebrate or commemorate, for the 250th anniversary of the United States. It is, as I said at the beginning, it's a bittersweet period for a lot of people. For Trump supporters or for white wealthy business people, it might be something to celebrate. But for minority groups, certainly people of color, but immigrants especially, it's a difficult time. And I want to talk about the Pope, who really is a thorn in the side of Donald Trump at the moment. The first American Pope has used his first major speech to praise the history of welcoming migrants, urging Americans to live up to the ideals put forward in the Declaration of Independence. This is his latest rebuke to Donald Trump. He said the word America has become a byword for freedom across the world because of the way the country welcomed migrants. Is this the way to approach this? Is just to double down on America's history, built by immigrants, built by people who were repressed also, but not trying to steer away from the true narrative and actually just remind people of the country's founding? So
Anthony, one of the things I'll note is that, and I don't want to wonk out on the listeners, but as a minister, one of the words we use is hermeneutics, which is the science of interpreting a text, right? So with the Pope is very familiar with interpreting texts to preach, to speak, and texts. The Torah, the Quran, the Christian Bible are histories. And so what the Pope is really doing here is he's taking our text, taking our history, interpreting it for the present moment, and speaking to the present and the future. And so when we think about our nation's history as a nation of migrants, immigrants, Native Americans, and enslaved people, the histories of these groups are tied together. So the reason why we are so diverse as a country frighteningly so for some people, right, is because literally the blood sacrifice of folks in the civil rights movement that gave rise to the Civil Rights Act, which abolished discrimination as a matter of law domestically. And then a year later, we have the Immigration Act, which abolishes discrimination in terms of immigration quotas internationally, right? And so what the Pope is doing is saying, when you look at these histories, the sacrifice of this group creates freedoms for this group, which creates more freedoms for this group, and literally beautifies and betters the country as a whole. And so the Pope is like speaking to the better angels of our nature, but he's speaking to our history as almost sacred text, right? Treating the Constitution, treating the civil rights laws and legacies as literally the text of the people. And so I think it's incredibly powerful.
Well, it's clever, though, isn't it? Because it's sidestepping Donald Trump's interruptions. And it's saying that this is what was written, this is the history, and we're going to ignore you because you're not worth it.
Exactly. Well, let me put it this way. The Pope is doing what a great many preachers, rabbis, and imams do, which is sometimes you got to speak over the heads of the people, right? You don't necessarily castigate the people right in front of you. You speak to where they should be, and in so doing, condemn and call out where they are. Right. And mind you, this Pope, who has African ancestry, Creole ancestry, is doing what a Baptist preacher by the name of Martin Luther King did, which again was using the founding, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution as sacred text, and literally directing, guiding, and inspiring people to go in a direction. And yes, he is calling out the president's policies by doing so, but he's doing it with what people revere.
Yes.
Right? They revere. Not everyone's a constitutional litigator like Professor Bromberg. But I can tell you, I come from a family from the low country of South Carolina. My fifth great grandfather fought for the rights of formerly enslaved people. I don't know whether he could have read the Constitution with the depth of a constitutional scholar, but he understood what it meant and what it promised. And so that's what the Pope did. And, the Pope, as any imam, rabbi, priest, or minister, sometimes you got to be pure-hearted, but also wise-hearted, savvy.
I sometimes think that his colleagues in the Vatican chose an American Pope because they knew that America needed a hand right now. And that if we'd have had a Polish Pope, then he might not have taken so much of an interest or gone head to head with Donald Trump in this way. Professor Bromberg, we talked earlier, briefly mentioned the separation of church and state. That separation has dissolved under this presidency to the point that this far-right Christian nationalism, which is not Christianity as I know it, is being preached from the pulpit of government. This is an unprecedented time. And if you heard Stephen Miller talk the other day, this kind of unelected aide to Trump who has been radicalized himself, clearly, it is a sorry state of affairs that the attitude of the people who are pulling the strings, manipulating Donald Trump, is one of a very minority view, and yet it has majority power.
I think that's right. And it's a part of a long haul game, right? This is a part of a long organizing effort that goes back to the 1980s with the Christian right to take over, to organize, to try to nominate and appoint members to the federal bench that are reflective of their views, right? And so I think that, especially on the 250th, something to consider is how are we positioning a pro-democracy movement? How are we getting jurists on the bench that have a history or appreciation, at least, in basic civil rights, that are looking at America, we the people, as a more holistic American family and not picking or choosing our favorite sons or daughters? And, I have to say, going to the prior question regarding the sad state of immigration in this country, we've seen battles play out literally in our cities, in Minneapolis, in efforts to deploy militia, essentially, to militarize our American cities and municipalities. In Newark, New Jersey, I represent Mayor Raz Baraka in the city of Newark. Mayor Baraka tried to investigate the conditions of Delaney Hall Detention Center and was essentially lured into an arrest on false pretenses and then maliciously prosecuted for a crime of trespass in his own city when he was invited onto the property, leading to the continued prosecution in federal court, not only of him in asserting his civil rights violations, but of Congresswoman LaMonica MacGyver out of Newark, New Jersey, for trying to protect an 80-year-old esteemed and beloved Congresswoman who is, it's no surprise that she's a survivor of cancer, and others from this hyped up militarized agenda of trying to essentially just execute and implement a white preference in our immigration policy. And we also see that more recently in the decision coming out of the Supreme Court this term with regard to the treatment of Haitians in this country. And the dissenting decision in that is very powerful because although the majority decision found that there was no racial epithets, essentially, and no racist agenda, the dissent did an extraordinary job of pulling out specific examples of essentially race baiting. And so the way in which this appears, this fight about America's family and who are our favored sons and daughters, is really playing out in the immigration context. And I have to say, specifically with regard to Delaney Hall, when you look at the extremity of the medical abuse that's being witnessed by individuals who have not committed any criminal act, right? These are civil violations. We are just in a very, very sad state of affairs. And I myself am an immigrant to this country and a naturalized citizen. Anthony, I assume that you are as well, or at least on your way, at least the immigrant part. And so, I think at the end of the day in America, we had more in common than what divides us. And that is a resilience to want to dream of a better country and an appreciation of what America is. America offers a lot that many countries don't, despite its shortcomings, which we have done a good job recognizing here. But, my parents, for example, came to this country, and I know many others that immigrate to this country because they believe in the American dream. And how do we make sure that we maintain that dream and that we don't backslide into an authoritarian and tyrannical state is the question of the day.
It's interesting that immigrants are the first people to want to assimilate, to go under the radar, to not break the law, to not get into trouble, to not cause a scene, because we are so grateful for the opportunity that we've been given to enter the country and live and work in the country. And that narrative is completely missing from any of the criticism or the coverage of how immigrants operate. And to criminalize people for doing very little. I mean, this is extended beyond immigrants now. We've seen this with the executions of Alex Pritty and Renee Good, American citizens just exercising their free speech rights. 50-year sentences handed down to protesters in Texas this week as well for doing not much. And even an Olympian who goes to the reflecting pool to check out this algae and sees a piece of floating detritus and touches it and is now receiving the harshest of sentences potentially with this prosecution. I mean, this is a despot who is really pushing all of these dictatorial buttons. Cornell, how do we qualify this? Because they started with the immigrants. Then they came for the protesters, and now they're going for, U.S. citizens who are just peacefully passing by.
Right.
I mean, why is everybody fair game now?
I think everyone's fair game because we've always been fair game at the hands of autocrats who seek to divide and conquer. So when we look at the history of who's called an immigrant, right? So when you look at the history of African Americans in the early part of the last century, Black folks who left the Jim Crow South fleeing racial terrorism, not unlike immigrants who've come to this country from other places fleeing terrorism, they were referred to as refugees, as internal immigrants. The National Urban League, which is thought to be a civil rights organization, at its inception was a refugee resettlement agency. Like literally Black folks were referred to, they talked about when Black people from the deep South, where I'm from, they talked about the way we spoke. How many of us lived together in crowded homes, the way we engage socially, the use of language. So my point being is there's more similarities than there are dissimilarities between the descendants of enslaved people in this country, migrants, immigrants, and then the folks who just who think that they've been here since the Mayflower. The point being here is autocrats have long been in the business of using laws to literally criminalize ordinary conduct, right? So the person who's criminalized for dipping their hand into the reflection pool, how is this unlike the Black codes and slave codes that literally criminalize jaywalking, criminalize literally going down the street? And so we have to be clear that people in power will attempt to divide and conquer us. So what that means is we have to think imaginatively in terms of creating, I would argue, bold, imaginative agendas that knit people together, remind people of what they have in common, and inspire them to move forward. And I would say the most effective weapon here is literally where we have, in the present moment, immigrants being divided with respect to citizens in this country, religious groups, right? The evangelicals on the left and right, Christians and Jews and Muslims. And so but my point being is this is a very Machiavellian game that the other side wins quite often. But the fact of the matter is, and Professor Bromberg has lifted this up, there are moments in our history during the period of Reconstruction where there were attempts at groups coming together, Native Americans, Black Americans, immigrants, right, in the civil rights movement. So the point being is that the past points very clearly, discreetly, policy in terms of policy and law in terms of the possibilities of the present. We've done this before, right? We need to be clear about this. So we are not inept and without resources, right? And so this, the whole thing, whenever I hear people talking about immigrants, I have to smile to myself because it's like, I'm Black, right? My people literally came from South Carolina, went to New York, went to DC. We sent our kids off to college. Many of our folks did well. And we used precisely the same strategies as people coming from El Salvador or Ukraine or wherever. The game does not change. And the whole idea that, immigrants want to keep their noses clean and obey the law. My God, my family, when it comes to, we are quite conservative in that sense. Get educated, work hard, keep your nose clean. And then once you succeed, make sure you help somebody else, right? We all do.
And we have seen that in this period. We've seen immigrants stepping up, and there are names that have become heroes of this modern day. Mahmoud Khalil, for example, or Romeza Ozturk, people who have fought back against the regime, and previously, these names might go under the radar, but we hear them now and we recognize them. My concern, though, is that this period is the deconstruction period, and that Donald Trump has infiltrated all of the institutions. And if we start with the Supreme Court, 6 of the 9 are radical. They are all far-right Christian nationalists with a Heritage Foundation Project 2025 agenda. And so, you know, and I mean, look, the rulings that have been handed down this week, aside from birthright citizenship, which I think was a you know, something that they couldn't really, it was logistically impossible to vote for because you'd have to.
That was far too close, though.
It was. But for example, they ruled that they don't have to reinstate, or Trump doesn't have to reinstate materials related to climate change or immigration or slavery that have been removed from national parks. That was a U.S. appeals court that announced that. So in the judiciary has been infiltrated. In the institutions, infiltrated. The cabinet is just full of these lunatics. And so the reconstruction that will need to come needs to be total, doesn't it? I mean, they will have to rebuild from the ground up, and it takes a lot longer to build than it does to destroy. Yael.
I mean, I think that's right. But the I don't want to say the fun part, but the fun part is in building. The fun part is in reconceiving, in working together, in creating the holy, multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-generational coalition that needs to come together. And I'll offer some, you know, a thought with regard to the last Black elected congressman, George White from North Carolina. And he was elected with the group of Black electeds during the nation's first Reconstruction, following the first Reconstruction amendments, right? Eradication of slavery, expansion of equal protection and due process under law, and expansion of the right to vote. And it was George White, when he became the last standing elected of that batch, due to the introduction and implementation of the Jim Crow agenda, that gave this farewell speech, essentially, with regard to, you know, when everything was on the line, when all hope would have reasonably been lost. And he said that Black Americans will rise up one day phoenix-like. We have blueprints about how this can be accomplished and how this has been accomplished in history, for a phoenix-like rise of proper representation, of authentic representation.
There is, in this short term, in these midterms, a high chance that Donald Trump will seek to nullify elections, federalize elections, do something that is considered completely abnormal and yet completely normal to him. Any war powers, who only knows? Professor Brooks, just going into these midterms and to 2028, you know, so much of what we're discussing and what you put in your op-ed will need to come after 2028 by leadership that really recognizes what is at stake and what needs to change. But what advice would you give to people in these elections approaching? Because turnout was not great for the primaries. Engagement is something that still, I believe, is not taken as seriously as it should be.
Right. So I think part of the challenge is framing the midterms in terms of a larger American project, right? So in other words, if we think about our first founding, right? So it wasn't merely about the Battle of Saratoga and Lexington and the Battle of Lexington and Concord or the Boston Massacre. It was a larger democratic project, right? The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So we have to think about the midterms, yes, imminent, right before us, but we also have to think about the day after. We are now the day after the 4th. So when we think about an American founding, right? So in other words, at the inception of the country, you had Native Americans, enslaved Americans, immigrants, if you will, from a relatively small band of countries. In the present moment, we have a multinational, multi-ethnic, multiracial democracy that requires a brand new set of rules, new amendments. And so my point is, we need a morally imaginative agenda, organize around it, and actually inspire people. right? So Yael used a word that we don't often use in politics: fun, celebratory, right? You have to inspire people, because the fact of the matter is, doom and gloom alone, it may be necessary, but it's not sufficient in terms of political motivation. So my point being is, you need a bold, morally imaginative agenda. We have that. We know the kinds of amendments to the Constitution that we can make. We have, I think, a very clear vision of the ways in which we can modernize elections. We have a good understanding how we can remove money from politics and put people back in the center of politics. With that kind of agenda, you can bring more people to the table and literally get beyond just the next election cycle. Because here's the thing: when we look at American polling in this country, there's a deep cynicism and pessimism that we are all suffering from on a bipartisan basis, right? So that alone is not enough to bring people to the table. You have to just inspire them with a concrete set of proposals, policies, amendments, legislation, and you have to organize at the ground level, which is why young people have to be at the center of this, right? So at the Harvard Kennedy School, I work with young organizations around the country. Professor Bromberg does the same. There are many people around the country who are doing this. But the challenge is, we have heretofore tried to get young people to support what we have long supported that has failed, right? So in other words, we tell them to turn out to vote where the results of the elections are essentially predetermined. So we have a racially gerrymandered Congress, and we're asking people to turn out to vote where the results are often predetermined. We got to offer more.
Yeah.
Right. And what we've called for in this op-ed is an agenda, but also a movement. Right. Because at the end of the day, when we think about the first founding was really populated by young protesters. We have forgotten that. Young soldiers. We have forgotten that. Yeah. So we are not calling for young people to go to war. In fact, we'd like to end the war that we're in. But we are calling for young protesters, young demonstrators, young voters, young advocates, young activists, young constitutional engineers and architects, right? That's the kind of agenda that brings people to the table. Because listen, when we think about it, the autocrats have done a good job, at least initially over the previous two presidential elections, of engineering enthusiasm for a bad agenda. Then we should do at least an equally, if not better job of engineering enthusiasm for a better, more progressive, more thoughtful, constitutionally and historically based agenda. That in my modest opinion, is what we should be doing.
Okay. We have to finish, but I'm going to put a link to the op-ed in the description below so people can read it. I'd like to wish you both a happy 4th for yesterday and a happy 250th for this nation. But for now, Professors Bromberg and Brooks, thank you for joining the Weekend Show. I'm Anthony Davis. Don't forget to support me and independent journalism on Substack, The Anthony Davis. I'll come back next Sunday with a brand new special guest and more factual news to discuss on the 5 Minute News Weekend Show with Midas Touch.